Right, hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us today at the first Uhusiano Capital and Further Africa webinar, A Brave New World, the new rules of engagement for impact investing and ESG. Let's go over some housekeeping rules before we start. We have a chat window where you can comment and interact with other participants, as well as a Q&A box for you to send questions to the panelists. Now, on with our program. As we all struggle to learn how to live in a new reality caused by this pandemic, every day we're observing a number of deep changes in our society. And with these changes, the question of sustainability becomes more and more evident, bringing some of the core principles of impact investing into virtually all investments going forward. Now, investors, promoters, and in fact, all stakeholders will face new risk profiles, and the way they look at impact investing opportunities is rapidly changing. We've seen different countries respond to this crisis differently, which will certainly create some new and very likely unforeseen opportunities as we come out of this crisis. One of the things is for sure, the principles of impact investing will be more important than ever before for everyone in all parts of society. So today, it's my great pleasure to moderate some of the brightest minds in this subject, who on the next hour will be sharing with us some of these answers and a few perspectives going forward into this brave new world. I have with me today Rana Moudaris, Impact Investing Director at Oxfam, Tara Collier, Entrepreneur in Residence at the Said Business School, University of Oxford, Mariana Grasso, Founder and Principal at MG Advisory, Tendai Mabikacheche, Head of Impact and ESG at Uhusiano Capital, Ruby Alcantara, Head of Entrepreneurship at Uhusiano Capital, and of course, the person responsible for bringing all of us together today, my dear friend, Christelle Kupa, CEO of Uhusiano Capital. So Christelle, I understand you're going to start with some perspectives from investors, is that right?
Great. Well, hello everyone, and thank you very much for dialing in. It's a pleasure to be with you here in this very we say different moment that we're all living in. Very pleased to have you all. I want to just kick off. We are in a pandemic season, so we need to obviously talk about some numbers. So currently in Africa, we do have the report are showing as of this morning, reported 95,000 cases, 3,000 fatalities currently, and reported 38,000 of recoveries. The most affected countries so far are Egypt, South Africa, and Algeria. Would like to also kick off with pandemic on, the effect on the pandemic on the African economy, of course, and the financial influx in Africa. The sector that are hardly hit, as you can imagine, are the industry of tourism and air travel. The International Air Transport Association has estimated that 55 billion of the economy is supported by them. Through this economy, 6.2 million jobs have been created, and the contribution to the African GDP is at the level of 2.6%. Ethiopia Airline have, as an example, due to the pandemic, has reported an indicated loss of 190 million so far. The tourism and travel sector could potentially lose up to 50 billion due to COVID. Another point that I would like also to mention is obviously the exports. Obviously, we can't go through the full economy in season, but we need just to point out a few important that are related to the pandemic. African export, due to the kind of decrease in the oil price, the drop in the oil price, has affected countries of the CIMAC mainly, and we can say that Angola and Nigeria, who are very reliant on oil, have been very badly hit. The hardest, I would say, industry that have been hit by the pandemic is the automotive industry and the airline, with respectively sharp loss of 44% and 42%. We also need to mention here that ODA, the Official Development Assistance Fund, which count about 9.2% of the GDP in low-income economies, are currently, of course, being restrained a little bit also on providing some capital, and we probably go a bit deeper on that. Let's take a closer look now on the revenue expenditure in the sovereign wealth debt. The average tax to GDP ratio that are currently estimated in Africa are 17.2%, which is very low to to help the basic social services, in particular in this occasion health services. Due to the pandemic, Africa could lose between 20 and 30% of its fiscal revenue. Government will have no option to rely on the international market, which can obviously increase the level of indebtedness. Now, let's talk also at the socio-economic sector, at least the employment that we want to take here. While the economy measure are indeed supported by the formal sector, it is very critical also that we take into account the informal sector in Africa. The informal sector accounts about 35% of the GDP and employs more than 75% labor force. We can now, I think, really swiftly move to measure that has been put in place to mitigate the economic effect of the coronavirus. We will look at continental measure as well as a national measure. On the continental measure, just picked a few, picked the African Development Bank, who has exceptionally put in place a COVID social bond at the level of 3 billion. This social bond will have a maturity of 3 years, and it has actually garnered the interest from central banks, treasuries, asset managers, and social responsible investors, which bid to a level and exceeding 4.6 billion currently. The other continental measure that I'd like to talk about is Afreximbank, that we all know. They've announced a 3 billion facility to help businesses, mainly its member. They count about 50 members within Afreximbank. They've put in place also direct funding, line of credit, guarantee, cross-currency swap, and different other similar instruments to alleviate the pain that countries are living currently. Later on, and I will leave that the pleasure to my colleague to go over more COVID fund and opportunity that are available for everyone. On the national measure, of course, we've got 55 countries. We can't go over all of them, but we just wanted to point out 4, in the 4 regions. North Africa with Algeria. Central Bank has reduced its compulsory reserve by 25 basis points to help, of course, the alleviate the economy. In West Africa, we've picked Sierra Leone. Central banks have reduced and lowered the monetary policy by 150 basis points. It has also created a special credit fund facility for the production and inject also liquidity in the banking sector. Southern Africa, we've picked Madagascar. The central bank has provided liquidity to finance the economy. It has injected 165 million into the economy. Then we go over East Africa with the least but not last, Rwanda. Rwanda have also put a lending facility at the level of 52 million to commercial bank. They've lowered the reserve requirement from 5 to 4%, allowing bank to have more liquidity as well. We also have to, have within this discussion, and we'll go a bit more in detail, but having also the general feeling from actual investors in Africa. Having had the time, we've been here 2 months in the lockdown, so we've carried on having conversation with our investors and reaching out to see what is the sentiment, seeing how Africa is still in the appetite that we can have. And It is true that investors will be, of course, more cautious, but Africa is still quite dearing to most of our investors and our impact investors. I just want to also just point out, a couple of industries that have been, I would say, taking a leap, a great way here are all tech-enabled industry, which goes without saying. We've got the fintech industry that before even the COVID had a lot of investment, especially coming from the venture capital. So fintech it's already, but I think it has accelerated the investment and the potential investment to be done in Africa. We have also digital education. Regardless where you are, I think children have been learning quite remotely, and all those digital education are quite important. So the traditional, of course, classroom, not that they're redundant, but they will help. They've helped certainly myself, but also I would say most people, and in Africa especially. I think that's also another topic that has been taking a lot of interest from investors. And last but not least, digital health, of course, in this pandemic situation, health, which is very key. We've seen a lot of companies such as drone, medical, tech, helping, sending masks and gloves to clinics. And I think those are very important also, topic and industry to support. So all in all, really, we've got, even though it's quite gloomy, but we still see that if Africa is not forgotten, Africa is still very much on the map. And I want to thank you for your time. We'll have some more time to Q&A at the end of the session. And I'll give back the mic to my colleague, Fabio. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. This is very interesting what you're mentioning, particularly about the measures that are being taken and implementing. I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit more about that later. Now, we know that a big share of African economies is made of informal business, just like you mentioned, and that means specifically a lot of small and medium companies. Since we're speaking of SMEs and their role on that recovery, I wanted to bring in Rana Modares, as she has a very interesting take on that as well. Rana.
Thank you, Fabio. And thanks to all of you at Uhusiano for bringing us together today to have this conversation, which is very timely. The way I'll spend my time is explaining why I think it's critical for impact investors to support SMEs through this pandemic, some ideas for how they can do that, what I think a risk for the impact sector might be, and time permitting, some silver linings that may result from the pandemic. So, how should investors be operating in the current context? How can they help limit the damage done by the pandemic in more fragile economies, and also to support them recover in the best way, or recover better, as we've been saying? So to start with, I think impact investors must continue and even increase support for a thriving small business sector. Small businesses, or SMEs, are really the lifeblood of a stable, successful economy. They comprise the biggest share of economic activity, and by interacting in different ways with both large companies and other small businesses, they create an ecosystem that economies need to be healthy. And they create about 80% of formal sector jobs in sub-Saharan Africa. So in terms of minimizing damage by maintaining employment, it's not multinational corporations we should be thinking about, but really the SME sector. And this also applies to the recovery. Insecure employment or unreliability of work is really the enemy of sustainable, equitable development that will be resilient in the face of shocks like this one. So beyond supporting SMEs to keep people employed through a period of crisis, we need to increase funding to SMEs if we want to have more resilient and equitable economies in the future. So what are concrete examples for how investors can help SMEs now? The answer is patient capital and willingness to take risk. For example, some investors have been considering solutions like bridge loans to SME lenders to keep them operating. A Swiss impact fund manager has created a COVID-19 emergency liquidity facility which allows quick dispersal of funds to companies that have been hurt by COVID-19. I don't have information on how this liquidity facility is being dispersed yet, but it will be really interesting to see that. I think this represents or could represent the kind of meaningful action that impact investors can take. In terms of what the risks for the impact investing sector are, as I said in the beginning, I think this might be a pivotal moment for impact investing because the tension between the financial and social considerations will inevitably now be highlighted. Investors might be under pressure not to lose money for their clients who may be taking losses elsewhere. We'll certainly see redemptions or withdrawals. And what that means is that some investors are becoming by necessity more risk averse. Some fund managers already will only disperse funds to clients that they know and have worked with before. This is entirely understandable from a risk management perspective. They're not able to do due diligence visits for the time being, but what will that mean for SMEs that don't have those relationships already established? Some managers will only invest in companies that have been better performing financially, tightening their standards, but what does that mean for the ones that were doing okay but are not quite there yet? I think this risk aversion might be a challenge to the foundational thesis of impact investing, which is that you don't have to make trade-offs between impact and returns. That thesis breaks down if impact investors shy away from SMEs that are less established or smaller, since these are often the ones that are more impact focused. So it's possible that this is a moment where the distinction between philanthropic capital and investment capital, which had really started to blur in the last couple of years, will again become more defined. But like many things, this still remains to be seen. With the time I have left, I'd like to wrap up with silver linings. This crisis has triggered a recognition of things that have been true for a long time, but overlooked for different reasons. For example, inequality. Inequality in the way people's livelihoods are impacted depending on the nature of their work. Informal workers or gig economy workers with no contracts have been hit so much harder than others. Inequality of access to healthcare, which is nothing new, but suddenly the implications of that are really stark and visible. Inequality in the way this affects women. The pandemic is testing health systems around the world, and women are often overrepresented in healthcare work, and so they're on the front lines of the pandemic, and also unpaid caring roles are almost always handled by women. I think Tara will take up the gender dimensions of the COVID pandemic later in the discussion, but it's another truth that's becoming harder for people to ignore. And I'm hopeful that a silver lining of the pandemic is to bring these issues to the front of our minds, and hopefully that will trigger change.
Thank you, Rana. These are some very good insights. Thank you very much for that. I've been actually noticing as I speak to some investors during this lockdown that the general approach towards Africa, it's beginning to include a lot of the ESG principles, but nevertheless, there's a lot of it to be addressed yet. So as we speak about SMEs as one of the largest shares of African economies, certainly the other share that we have to mention will be agriculture. And a lot of impact investing projects revolves around agri, and there were already great numbers of challenges in the sector this year. Even before we got hit by COVID, the crisis affected the entire value chain of agriculture, but perhaps more than ever before, it will become a great part of the solution going forward. So I'd like to hear from Mariana Grassa, bring her in now with some of the agriculture prospects, among other things. Mariana?
Thank you so much, Fabio. First of all, thank you for the invitation and for bringing us all together. I have the difficult task of addressing a whole sector in 50+ countries in 5 minutes, so wish me luck. I will not be speaking so much about how successful certain interventions have been, because we don't really have enough data at the moment to assess that. But agriculture has been at the forefront of a lot of interventions, and there is an understanding that there's a severe impact to food security under this pandemic. So first and foremost, I want to focus on COVID in what I call context. So prior to COVID, there were already issues in the sector and in the continent in 2020. And most people will tell you they didn't go away, they were perhaps exacerbated, and now we're having to learn to deal with them, and responses have to be pivoted. One of the key challenges has been locusts. So locust is a destructive migratory pest that has been affecting the continent quite widely. In a normal circumstance, it would be very hard to address this pest, but now where we're under severe movement restrictions imposed by COVID-19 that limits access to inputs, as for example pesticides, limits access to human capital and equipment that could address this pest, it becomes even harder. So I think that perhaps is one of the biggest impacts of this crisis, is the disruption of value chains, the logistics challenges that it's bringing. But the context that we were in as well was one of climate change, changing weather patterns that affected not only the continent, but also affected us all in the world, and had already been affecting food security and prices. So any initiatives and intervention will really have to have this context in mind. They also need to cater in this particular sector, agriculture, to a plethora of crops that is grown across the continent. And that is very hard to curate that finance and agricultural investment. It's quite a technical job. And I'll give you a broad example. This is, for example, with maize and soya, you're looking at 3 to 5 months from planting to harvest, right? So, you know, this specific working capital model that you need to address there. You need to consider the availability of staff for planting and harvest, availability of inputs at the right time before the rains, otherwise you just lose a season. Versus, you know, tree crops, which you have planted 12 years ago and you're reaping the rewards now. So again, very different cycle in terms of working capital, labor, inputs required, and technical assistance. So these are all the things that investors are having to look at. They also need to consider the jurisdiction of the intervention. You know, if we speak about, say, Burkina Faso or South Sudan, as we know, it has been faced with conflict. There was already a vulnerable food security situation pre-COVID, versus a place like Ghana with a very stable economy and a striving, a stable democracy and a striving economy. It has challenges, but these were, you know, slightly different. So this is the context that COVID has come through in the continent and in the sector. I think similar to Rana, what I will say is exacerbating what was already there. And for most of the stakeholders in agriculture and most of African governments, it highlights the reliance on imports to feed the population, which now is being disrupted. Say, for example, with rice, 40% of the rice consumed is imported. And as we know, the likes of India, the likes of Pakistan, which are major exporters, have halted those exports. So investment in domestic grown crops is important. It was already an issue that we were discussing, so now we need it even more. The second point is investment in infrastructure, one that can build resilience to deal with climatic change and these, you know, outbreaks of diseases. So, you know, I'm talking about roads to access markets. I'm talking about irrigation. You know, I'm talking about warehouses, storage. That's what's really was needed, and now it's needed more than ever. I would say to mitigate the effects of this pandemic is not easy. And if I take you a little bit on a journey, if you think about, for example, if there's a drought, you know, the issue would be supply, right? You wouldn't produce enough and therefore there would be an issue with supply, and you do certain interventions to mitigate that. If we look at the financial crisis that we just passed, lack of purchase power would mean a demand problem. So again, you would put interventions in place to mitigate that. What we faced with COVID is both supply and demand challenges, right? Challenges in cash crops, challenges in staple crops. And those are very, very difficult to address with one or two interventions. So to wrap up, I would just like to talk about the interventions being deployed. So they're not new. Input subsidies, for example, programs are being deployed by Ghana and Nigeria. Government purchase programs of particular crops are being put forward by Malawi and Zambia. These are not new, but only time will tell if they are enough. What I think is important is any sort of intervention should be done in synergy. This is not a national problem. This is not a regional problem. This is not an Africa problem. It's a world problem. And therefore, any type of interventions need to be done together, and trade policies should reflect that. One example that I would give is trucking logistics. A huge issue for specifically smallholder farmers that are seeing crops rotting in their fields, depots waiting for trucks to come, and that's not happening. Kenya has been at the forefront, now imposing sort of mandatory testing for truck drivers, and the rest of the countries in East Africa are trying to adopt a harmonized system to put that in place. So that would be great regional dynamics coming through. To sort of end on a good note, Fabio, I would just like to remind ourselves that the continent and its people have been resilient and pulled through challenging disease outbreaks like Ebola. So actually, we have a lot to learn from the innovation and creativity and resilience that I'm sure they'll be showing us in months to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Well, I'm as guilty as you are. I'm always positive about it. I look at what the company has been through before, and I also believe that a lot of people will be surprised of how this resilience will allow us to come out of this stronger than before. Now, one of the things that we realize is that as countries come into a state of emergency and resources got redirected to the epidemic response, oversight of a number of fronts was compromised. Like it was pointed before, it's no secret that the most vulnerable part of the population suffered the hardest. And I wonder how deep is the impact on minorities, and how should this issue be addressed? Now, Tara Saber-Collier, it's what I consider an authority on equality and inclusion. So it would be great to hear her insights. Tara.
I think Tara is muted.
Hi, good morning, guys. Thanks for having me today. Delighted to discuss this with you all and learn from you all. Gender lens investing has been a hot topic for a while now. It's already been increasing in the past 4 years from 100 million in 2014 to 2.4 billion in 2018. And then it just comes along and crashes with the COVID epidemic, as has been the case with all sectors. Rapidly growing investment segment, and now trying to grapple with the realities of COVID. And there have been a lot of COVID impact investment responses over the past month. You've seen so many relief funds be launched, but initially, at least, a lot without a gender lens. So, launching a fund for SMEs and energy, education, health, of course, health, but not with a gender lens. And as my colleagues rightfully pointed out, this crisis is hitting the most vulnerable the hardest. And that means, above all, women, because if you know about feminized poverty, you know that women are 70% of the poorest of the poor. in the world. So this is starting to change as people wake up to the reality of the need for a gender lens. And it needs to, because COVID is going to be particularly deleterious for women and girls because of a few factors. Obviously, in the short term, there's things like gender-based violence, which is affecting at least 1 in 3 women in Africa. And being shut in with your partner is just going to exacerbate that. There's things like women's overrepresentation on the front lines in the health and social services sector, where we're about 70%. So we're being more exposed. And then, of course, the fact that the cuts in government budgets, the cuts in social sector activity further worsens women's economic situation because of being overrepresented in those sectors. And then to add to that, going home, where women have to deal with at least 2 to 3 times higher labor requirements, especially when you have children at home. This already in the West, where COVID has been much more severe, and I'm talking about US and UK particularly, has led to way higher percentage of women's job losses. So women are over 60% of the job losses in the US. And that data hasn't come out of Africa yet because obviously the pandemic is still beginning. But we would expect, without action, for it to be a similar trend. And then you have the lens of entrepreneurship. We already had a situation in Africa, which is the biggest gender pay gap, where women had limited funding for their businesses, where women's businesses typically have 38% less profits than their male counterparts' businesses when it comes to SMEs. We already had a situation where there was an 18% financing gap for women-led companies. So what this means is, as companies start to go bankrupt and have to close, you're going to see that more with the women-led companies. And that's going to trickle out. And now as governments come up with relief funds, there have been no special provisions for women-led companies, and there's been no tailoring for women-led companies. So, even if it were a sector-specific tailoring or tailoring that's based on the income level of companies, there's been no tailoring to ensure that women-led companies are more likely to survive, and as a result, they're way more likely to die. So before this happened, impact investors were, really mounting up and getting on board with gender lens investings. And right now there's been this disruption where people are all considering how COVID will affect the SDGs they work on, whether that's education or health or whatever SDG they're tackling in. But we can't forget that SDG 5 for gender equality and SDG 10 for equality, broader equality, have significant, massive synergies with all of the other SDGs. We know that higher rates of inequality lead to worse economic growth and higher rates of strife and failed states. We know that higher rates of gender equity, if women were set equal to men, we'd have 26% higher global GDP growth. We know that, so we can see that on a macroeconomic level and on an enterprise level, integrating this lens for equality and for gender and for women's empowerment can have a significant impact on the financial and social viability of impact investments. Now it's getting more people to consider that and operationalize that. And that doesn't have to be a hardline premise of saying we're only going to back women-led companies. In fact, that's probably not the most realistic way to go about that, because women are less likely to start companies and are, based on some studies, less represented in the companies that are going to scale. One of the things that we and other impact investors are doing is a more comprehensive approach with our current portfolio, and hopefully in subsequent portfolio companies, is a comprehensive approach. So we're looking at gender impact, every portfolio company's impact on women as consumers, employees, and founders and entrepreneurs in the value chain. So that means that when you go through your portfolio, you're understanding how is each portfolio company going on training and hiring women? What is the representation of women in their workforce and in their leadership? How are they serving women consumers? What are the partnerships they have to integrate women-led companies into their supply chain? And how can we rework this? How can we incentivize this? What partnerships can we build? Whether it's partnerships to train the women that they already employ or find ways to source more women-led companies into their supply chains. There's a plethora of ways this can be built in, I think that's a more reasonable, strategic, and sustainable long-term approach to integrating gender, and that I think you'll see more impact investors take up in the future, so that gender is integrated and we can ensure the success of our portfolio companies, but considering the broader impact of inequality, especially gender inequality.
Well, thank you very much, Tara. Wow, I have to say that's some amazing insights. I mean, you have, this crisis obviously exposing a lot of the handicaps, a lot of the concerns that we already had before. Thank you so much, ladies. Where do we go from here, right? I mean, the rules of the game are clearly changing now, and stakeholders will have to adapt. Like everything else, strategy is key, and there's nothing like being prepared for what's coming next. But it's very difficult to say nowadays what's coming next. In this case, it's not so easy to figure that out. So let's hear from Tendai Mabikashechi and Ruby Alcantara from Uhusiano Capital on some of the practical tools on ESG and impact investing that we can use going forward. Tendai and Ruby?
Thanks, Fabio. Tendai, you're on with me?
Yes, yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Okay, cool. So when we approached this and when we were talking about the webinar, and once again, thank you everyone for joining with us today. It's such a pleasure to see so many of you. Great questions coming in. Please keep it coming. It's just awesome. And once again, thanks to the fellow panelists. When we put this webinar together, one of the key things that we really saw is how do we actually brace for this new world? At the end of the day, COVID is here to stay. We can't talk post-COVID world, pre-COVID world. We are in the COVID world. And so what does this mean in terms of how this will affect our business? And what Tendai and I are going to go through is some practical tools that you can utilize to help integrate ESG and impact investment, whether you're a fund manager investing in businesses on the continent, or whether you're an entrepreneur who is never considered, or a business owner who's never considered impact and ESG before, and how can you actually integrate it within your business? So when we actually look at a company, in general, we always have 4 key factors that we always look at. First, we look at the idea. What is the key idea behind the company itself? We then look at the team. I always love this picture because this is just such a strong team, yeah? But they always say you can have an A idea, but a B team, you'll never go far. But if you have a B idea, but an A team, you can go very strong, very far, very fast. Commercially viable, obviously, of course, it does need to make money. Otherwise, how can you continue to sustain yourself? And that there is scalability to your business. What we are now seeing in COVID world and post-COVID world, the effects, and as our fellow colleagues have mentioned on the panel, throughout various different industries and sectors, what we need to be able to look at. We want to walk you through some practical tools, how you can help your business out. Tendai?
Yeah, so it's an honor to be speaking to you all. And we just want to share our insights in terms of the research that we've been doing over the last 2 months in the context of the COVID pandemic. We've looked at ESG and impact themes and the impact on the financial performance of businesses. So we've taken a selection of a few global companies and looked at what are the trending and highest themes really that have been coming up in terms of environmental, social, and governance performance. So basically ESG. And so when we look at it from a governance perspective, we're seeing business continuity and risk management being the 2 areas that companies are currently having to really try and work around in terms of the impact on the financial performance of the business. But additionally to this, we're also seeing health and safety, employee well-being, and community engagement ranking very, very high, obviously as a result of the pandemic. But what I just want to highlight as we now start to speak about this is that we have spoken about leading and lagging indicators. And a lot of the times when you look at some of these social issues, they've ranked quite low in terms of risk registers, in terms of materiality. But at this current point in time, they've now become the highest ranking issues that are having an impact on financial performance. And I'll put this all in context when I move on to the next slide. But just looking from an environmental perspective as well, we're looking at materials and resource management being quite key in terms of the impact on the bottom line. So currently, as businesses are operating, these are what we have identified to be the core issues that are having a major impact on the financial performance of companies. But from an impact perspective as well, it's quite interesting to look at how companies have been identifying individually the different SDGs that they're impacting. But from the companies that we assessed, the core indicators and the core SDGs and impacts that they're now looking to make are around no poverty, good health and well-being, responsible consumption and production, clean water and sanitation, and decent work and economic growth. But why is this all so important? And this is where really we will give you our 2 cents in terms of where we see this going, and why these new rules we need to operate in terms of a new way of thinking and understanding why ESG and impact will be here to stay. So just moving on to the next slide.
Tendai, before we move on to the next slide, for people who may have not been really familiar with ESG versus impact, can you explain a little bit more on that?
Of course. So ESG really is an acronym, like I said, that talks about environment, social, and governance. But those are factors that are used to measure the sustainability impact of an investment within a business. But also this helps determine the future financial performance of the business. So the two are very correlated, ESG performance to the financial returns. But when we look at impact, we're now looking at the long-term value. So now we're looking at the developmental impact that a business is having or an investment is having on a longer term. So for example, the SDGs I just referred to would be from an impact perspective.
Awesome. Thanks, Tendai.
So just moving on then to the key points that we want to make at this point in time is really 3 key things we would want you to take away. And this is determining, firstly, materiality, risk, and long-term value. This is what we see being the new rules of engagement. So historically, companies have been conducting materiality assessments, which really is determining and prioritizing the most important issues within your business from an environmental, social, and governance perspective. So what we have identified, even as we've been conducting our own research on this end, is that some of those lagging indicators, such as community engagement, health and safety, which were seen as important but not ranking as highly, have suddenly taken the center stage and have come at the top. And what we're saying to companies, so instead of conducting materiality assessments once in a couple of years, it's important to now do these more regularly and be sure to understand what are the issues that are likely to come up in the current season, as well as in the next coming years. And of course, keeping this fluid so that you can identify any new issues that are likely to come up as a result of that. So for us, that's the key and most important. But closely tied to this is risk. So risk management. Again, looking at risk registers, and I think I referred to this a bit earlier, that there have been quite a few environmental and social issues that have been identified within organizational risk registers. But really, there needs to be a change in the way you consider and what you include as risks within the business, and that these are not sidelined, but are part of your core business and how you identify risk moving forward. So looking more holistically across all your environmental and social and governance risks.
And what are some examples of risks that as a business we need to consider?
Okay, so for example, in this current moment, as I've just said, for employee well-being is quite important, and particularly health and safety being one of the key areas, and wellness. So I'm just using these as key examples at this point in time, which usually sit in the SHE team or the environmental team or the social team. But now these need to be looked at more holistically in the context of what happens if anything goes wrong in relation to any of these specific themes. So for me at this point in time, definitely employee and health and safety related issues are key as risk. And then just moving on to long-term value, the final point we have around that is companies need to determine and develop their impact thesis and theory of change, which really talks about what is the impact you're looking to make now and the impact that you're looking to make over the next 5, 10, 15 years. But of course, keeping this as a fluid structure such that you continue to understand and see what's likely to be coming in. So I see this impact thesis tying in quite closely to the materiality and risk management, which I've spoken about just a bit earlier.
And I think that makes a lot of sense for entrepreneurs. But if I'm an entrepreneur who's never really considered all these things or ever approached it in this way, what sort of frameworks or maybe some practical tools? I know at Uhusiano, we could also help entrepreneurs or fund managers, but walking away from this webinar, what do you think some entrepreneurs can do?
Okay, so actually I was just going to come to that point myself. So there are a couple of frameworks, and I've just highlighted these now for yourselves, particularly those who haven't been looking at this, but it really breaks it down in terms of materiality, which is the first one I spoke about. How do you identify the issues most important to your business and being able to foresee what kind of issues will be important over time. And the Global Reporting Initiative does a really great job at this. But in addition to that, we've got the Global Impact Investing Network metrics, as well as SDGs, which help you on the impact perspective. So how do you identify your impact and where can you make that long-term value? And then from an ESG perspective, the IFC environmental and social standards are amazing and great in terms of seeing what your environmental, social, and governance risks are. And particularly during this COVID pandemic, I think it's a good time for companies to relook at themselves and ideally go back to these frameworks again and see how you can restructure yourselves.
Awesome, Tenda. I think that makes a lot of sense, and just to like bring all things together. I mean, what do we say would be the key for businesses now in the COVID world? And one of the key things that we've seen is like how a lot of businesses have had to pivot, what Tendai was referring to in terms of business continuity, how businesses really need to continue to be prepared, analyze their respective risks. We've seen a number of businesses also thrive during this pandemic. For example, the Fintech sector. The Fintech sector prior to the COVID world, or prior to the COVID, had already attracted about 50% of the startup capital that had gone into Africa. So that was about $1.34 billion of startup capital that had gone into the continent. 50% went into fintech. So technology-based solutions, you can see it really increasing a lot. As Christelle mentioned in her opening, there are a number of key areas. So when we look at what are key for businesses today, number one, preparedness. It's all going to be about preparedness, as Tendai mentioned, about making sure that you have your risk register, analyzing your respective risks. Adaptability is going to be key. How are you able to adapt? How are you able to pivot in terms of your business model? And thus to therefore then anticipate what might be coming next. And we see the effects that it's had on the supply chain. And during Mariana's talk, she spoke about the effects on the respective supply chains across the channels. So this is one of the key areas. How do you anticipate for some of the further risks that might come to be? And lastly, as we conclude in this part of our takeaways and practical tools, we know Christelle mentioned a number of the funding opportunities, and also Rana also mentioned as well. But we wanted to take a look at just some specific opportunities. We're not going to go through this list, but right now we see that the World Bank had committed about $18 billion for COVID response efforts to the continent. Meanwhile, we see that African Development Bank is committing $10 billion through the COVID crisis response facility, in which $1.35 billion is marked for the private sector. This is a very long list of various different facilities that are supporting COVID relief. So for example, this one is South African Chamber of Commerce that's helping youth who already have existing businesses. So there are a number of COVID relief funds that are actually available and out there, and all it takes is a little bit of a search. So on that note, that's our Uhusiano Capital's practical tools on bracing for a new world. And Fabio, I bring it back to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is truly amazing. Sorry, here we go. Truly some amazing insights. I mean, that goes to say that if you are, if you are getting ready, preparing yourself, there are many tools that you can use, many ways that you can actually navigate through this situation. Well, there you have it, new reality, new rules. Now, obviously, we want to get a little bit of questions from our attendees. Make sure we cover some of the very interesting questions. So let me begin with a question coming from Kenneth in Nairobi. And this one goes to Rana. He's asking, what impact do you think the pandemic has for the prospects of ESG investing? Will we hinder or improve the prospects?
Sure, hi. I think the prospects for ESG investing have improved overall. Something we saw through the period of turbulence in global financial markets in March was that ESG investment strategies were effectively proven successful. They outperformed benchmarks, largely because most of that turbulence, at least initially, came from a fall in oil prices, so a sector not held by ESG funds. And also the tech sector wasn't hit as hard as the market overall, and ESG funds tend to have a high allocation to the tech sector. So I think the result is that it's more credible to say that better investment practice from a social perspective leads to better financial performance. I think this means we can engage investors on consideration of non-financial factors, and it would be easier to do that. I think specifically on environmental considerations, COVID is an example. It's a case where we've seen very clearly what happens when we ignore scientists. And scientists have been sounding the alarm about the economy for years, or even decades now. And I also think it's an opportunity to push further on the S of ESG, conversations about how companies treat employees, about precarious work, about healthcare, about sick leave, and other issues related to supporting a resilient economy will all feel more relevant now that we've seen the consequences of undervaluing them. So I don't think ESG will drop off the agenda in any way. I think if anything, it'll be accelerated.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. I think a lot of the concepts, the base core values of ESG are going to start to be incorporated in areas that we'd be surprised. Anyway, the next question I have goes for Tara. It comes from Desiree from the African Women Entrepreneurship in London. The question is about funding for women-led and women-focused NGOs. We know a lot of funding is going to COVID rapid response or companies that are directly impacted by it. What about other industries that are outside of health, education, and fintech?
The COVID relief funding is cross-sector, and gender lens funding is cross-sector. However, when it comes to impact investment, because most impact investors are seeking a return, NGOs, women-focused NGOs, whether it's for health or education or anything else, would have to consider what strategy they would use to be able to deliver the commercial returns, because we know that the social impact side is already there.
Right. Thank you very much, Tara. Next question goes for Mariana. It comes from Jason from New York City. Jason is asking if you could elaborate a little bit more about the key challenges that specifically agriculture companies are facing from this experience.
Sure. So the first question that I think we need to ask ourselves is, where in the value chain is that company, right? So I think most of us think of agriculture and think about primary production, whereby there's so many stakeholders, there's traders, there's processors, and all of these are facing different challenges. If you're in the value addition spectrum, your challenges are completely different. There's the standard ones, sort of availability of staff. If you're in a processing or production unit, the fact that you have to separate and social distance make the efficiency be lower. There's a reduced productivity in that sense if you're looking more at the value additions. But I think access to markets is one of the key ones, really, because of the limiting infrastructure that we know of. Now, getting the smallholders getting to those markets or being able to place their products in the markets is harder. A lot of this trade is done via informal markets. So now either you have to consider growing another crop, finding another market, and that all entails a lot of capacity building and technical assistance. So that goes together with impact investing does best. It's not just financing, but then it's trying to find solutions and assisting, these investees technically with what they need. What I have seen, Fabio, is that actually there's a lack of awareness of support. And I think, some of the messages coming through the Q&A sort of reflect that. There is support out there for agricultural companies specifically. The support is appropriate to needs in many cases, but unfortunately, it's just getting to know that it is out there and that you can access it.
Great, that's great. Thank you very much for that answer. The next question goes to Tendai. So Tendai, we have Lucas coming from Brazil. Okay, with countries such as South Africa expecting to peak only towards the end of the year, it is likely that other Southern African economies will follow the same trend. In what sectors will impact investment be needed in the next years, considering various shifts in demand and supply on emerging markets? Tendai, you mute. Now you have it.
So yes, so healthcare definitely will get a lot more funding moving forward. And we're looking at some of the specific areas that have been growing across the African continent over the last 5 years. And healthcare has been trending quite significantly. And I only see this growing in terms of the solutions and opportunities that are arising as a result of what we're going through now, but also to position Africa and particularly sub-Saharan Africa for the future, particularly our businesses and how we can support our communities. In addition to that as well, will be water. I believe water significantly will also grow in terms of the importance of investing in water to support communities in light of the COVID pandemic. We're not sure how long this will be in terms of the pandemic and when things will change, and if it will only get worse for the African continent. But in my perspective, at least, those two are highly trending. Then, of course, followed on by energy, coming quite close underneath that. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was the one who was muted. Now, thank you, Tendai. Ruby, for you now, we have a question from Stephanie Malta. What will be the impact in infrastructure sector, especially in roads and bridges, and how long do you believe it will be felt for? Ruby?
Oh, I get the infrastructure question. I think one of the key things that we're seeing is where investors are looking to prioritize right now, and what are some of the key areas. What are governments looking to prioritize, and where are the investors looking to prioritize right now? And as Tendai had just mentioned just now, the healthcare sector is going to be getting a lot of the major focus. Will some infrastructure projects go on hold? That's some of the things that we're seeing a lot out there. So what priorities would infrastructure be? It could, as Tendai mentioned, energy could be a major one that we'll see in terms of the uptake and picking things back up. Right now, we just feel that the world is on a pause, but we're seeing areas where relief is coming through. If any of my other fellow panelists have more to add to that, I would welcome it.
No, I think that pretty much sums it up. The next question goes for Christelle. It comes from Giacomo in London. Christelle, with emerging market debt ballooning, how much risk does this pose for Africa? Are there serious credit risks to the region? And do you think it will be a deterrent to any fixed income investments into African credit specifically?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I'm not, like an economist either, but given that the country indebtedness will most likely become higher, I believe that we will, face, I would say a lot of, I won't say country risks, but, the indebtedness of the country taking more loans, or maybe what we need to do, or what economies, or like where countries do get their loan, is to potentially get other people, and you know, like the G7, there's the SDR, for instance, there's a special drawing right, which is a big fund formed by the G7. Maybe is to you know, kind of give the money or support the African economy now, rather than waiting when the economy goes really bad. So it's kind of doing more the prevention, trying to stop, you know, country to become even more indebtedness. That's, you know, something that we've actually experienced here in Europe not so long ago, and trying to prevent that by helping and supporting that very strong transition into, you know, for the next few years, because COVID is today, but you know, the effect of the ripple effect will still be with us for the next few years, and it's really something that we need to live with, and that government and groups and association needs to be aware. Thank you for the question,
Christelle. Well, on that note, Christelle, but we're running out of time, so I would like to ask if you have any final remarks before I thank our panelists.
Well, thank you so much for everyone to join us. We were a very great number to dive in. So thank you again. We have taken all the questions. I'm sorry that we've not been able to answer all those questions. As you can see, we really put a really great panel so that we can, you know, keep on communicating with you on what we are seeing in the market, what we want to do, and hopefully how we can partner together in the next future. All the questions will be taken, and we will try to reach out to people as and when we can. Thank you again.
Right, and just to answer one question, sorry?
Thank you again for all my experts and panelists to have taken the time, because time is there, but it's still very precious because we're all still very busy, as you can see. And thank you again for your great input. And thank you, Fabio, for moderating all this very strong women-led panel.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege. I just want to make one last comment. I see some people asking if the presentation is going to be available. I believe that the presentation and the video will be available afterwards. So we'll make sure that we let everybody know how to get access to that. I want to thank Ruby, Tende, Christelle, Tara, and Mariana. It's been truly a privilege and an experience to be here with you today. Thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.